Why don't you start by introducing yourself as you would if you were in a native gathering or in a mixed gathering?
Greetings from Green Bay on this March 30th, 2023, which is a spring day, but it's cool here in northeast Wisconsin. If I wasn't here, I would be up in northern Wisconsin along the southern shores of Lake Superior. My name is Richard Ackley. I'm age 77. I grew up in the north, and I've lived many years here in Green Bay. I would say if I was with the Ojibwe communities, there's 155 or more in the United States and First Nations Canada. I would say, I would say Wuju Niji or Anin. I do not know my native language. I understand it in the context of the background. Most of my life I've spent working with people either in university settings, planning. I worked 18 years as a judge. My family values education, and over the years I have a deep interest in indigenous spirituality, Judeo-Christian spirituality, or Old Testament, New Testament, and currently at age 77 I'm involved in a Master's Divinity program at Buxley Seabury Seminary in Chicago, which is a cohort of 12 individuals who are doing a seminary training. But that's not as important as I just enjoy being in a setting where learning is such a part of my life. But the culture I'm from, the Ojibways, we just value being in the setting. I often said it's where culture and environment coexist. So my journey of life has been one to find that balance.
What does it mean to you to be Native and Christian?
I would say it's a sequential dynamic, and since I was not missionized or colonized, or I believe that growing up in the north in a small tribal community, the tribal community became more amplified than the religious aspect. I went to a Roman Catholic mission school, but every morning I'd walk by the Methodist church, and maybe I've been blessed, or maybe it's part of my life experience. My grandparents who raised me did not subject me to any religious dogma or any religious mandatory requirement to attend. The Roman Catholic sisters, that was the order, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration out of La Crosse, Wisconsin, never really pushed religious dogma by dogma, the mandatory dynamic on me. And maybe my delight of growing up in a community where I was allowed to be who I was, in spite of all the, growing up and the difficulty just being a young person, I did not really crystallize or get introspection of what it means to be indigenous Judeo-Christian till I attended Northland College in northern Wisconsin. Many, many years ago, over 52 years ago, I took a class in contemporary Western religious heritage, where we shared a variety of experiences. And since then, I've embarked upon my journey of the elders who kind of guided me to understand my indigenous worldview. I chose more of an abstract understanding of that without the language, without the regalia, or without the symbolism. But the symbolism I come out of would be one of location and a sense of space. So to answer you carefully, unless if you're indigenous, I believe you have to start first with the indigenous construct or the indigenous tribe you're part of, and then you formulate that into a Christian formation, and the old words they used in the 60s with the Judeo-Christian. How that magnifies in each human being is totally different, but the two aspects of that is one is individual aspect within a kinship or within the tribal system. Denominational polity has been an irritant to me throughout life, but my creator-centered, my Jesus-centered, or my spirit-centered has always been present. So I believe it's been enhanced by my traditional Ojibwe experience because they have a variety of constructs. One would be the four directions. The other one would be the rising in the east. The seasonality of, even though it's spring, it's cool, the relationship to summer, to fall, and to winter. So there's a natural cycle. And one of my best friends over the years who studies, and I tend to gain a lot from what I call collaborative religious scholarship or relational. My one friend says, one thing with your tribe or your indigenous community you're part of, Richard, is the Ojibwe or Chippewa or Anishinaabe, which technically means the spontaneous human beings. That tradition has been around for thousands and thousands of years. And he says the reason why indigenous people believe in Christianity, they're into the natural order of the universe. And by natural order, you don't attach guilt, you don't attach those constructs. So in some ways, the Creator, the Spirit, and Jesus Christ's message is something that's part of me, but in absence of the internalized oppression of settler colonism is, in my view, attempted to exploit the goodness of traditional people who, the culture I'm from, you wanted to hunt, fish, and gather and live in harmony with your nature, in harmony with your family. When we got out of harmony is when the settler or the Europeans entered this realm. And someone will say, how do you document that your tribe was into the natural order? I said, recently, the Northern Lights danced across northern Wisconsin. I probably don't have this problem explaining to Norwegians, Swedish, Finnish, and Sami people, because it's the same latitude. But I may have problems explaining the German, the English, the little lower latitudes. So there's been a natural connection over the year with certain European groups, but every human being needs to find that own sense of place to celebrate their own ceremony and to unplug from the complexities of our world. I'm thankful for this method of communication, but it doesn't replace the cold or the warm walk along the southern shores of Lake Superior. That's so important because when tourists come through, they said, I immediately want to go down to the lake if they're allowed to in tribal lands. And I don't often remind them the best time to go down there is when there's a northeast wind blowing. Because if you don't, you will be bit by mosquitoes, sandflies, deer fly. There's any kind of mosquito, but people who want instant understanding of the environment don't realize there's a seasonality to the nature that comes out. And when the wind blows, that's when you walk along the beach. But these little simple nature constructs are really important to me. And as a child growing up along the rivers, I say there's three ways of communication. There's a linear way, and then there's the circular way. And then I added a third one, but no one seems to get the meandering rivers as you meander down the Lake Superior. And I used to row a boat down there and just let my fishing rod and the bobber draw. But it was so much fun just rowing the boat. I didn't often at times get to the 3 miles rowing, but there was a gentleness and the heartbeat. And this could be, because spring training is coming, the heartbeats of the season are something you have to be attached to. And if you're not attached to that, then you're sort of out of kilter.
Wow, there's so many good images there, and what you talked about, I'd like to kind of get back to several of them. Before I leave this question, I'd be interested to hear, because your experience has been mostly positive with people that have nurtured you into building a kind of a positive mosaic. Where have you experienced tensions in between those two identities?
Okay, I would say that tensions are in any tribal community. There are the cultural negative type individuals. I call them cultural spiritual bullies. If they're people who have either adapted or assimilated a behavior that is unhealthy, so therefore you have to make choices of either succumbing to that negativity or maintaining some type of independence. By independence, it doesn't mean you're not fearful, you're not aware of that, but what you try to do is manage the conflict and mitigate the people in their lives who are trying to dominate you. It could be their individual behavior, it could be an assimilated behavior, and I have great respect for order, great respect for legal systems, tribal systems. What I do not have a respect for, and maybe at my age 77, I tended to trust the wrong people. By that, the wrong people were people who had the inability to do three things in my life. One is, if you're tested, then you can keep repeating the same behavior over and over again in improvement. But if the testing relies upon a mathematical grade, then that's not healthy. Two, if you express a desire to achieve something, today with the differences of support systems, they'll help you along. The intervention, the assessments will help you along. And the third one is, what do you manifest? What drives you to do things? And if you're driven to do something, what is discovered? But what I've noticed is human beings are the cultural system that I came out of, the border town between the tribal community. I was accepted in the family system of my grandparents who ran a business, but I had to run the relationship in the pitfalls of negativity in a marginal, poor community, taking the bus, going to the local public high school. I chose the public high school rather than the Roman Catholic school because I wanted the freedom. I actually liked the sisters, but I was unsure of the method of teaching in the Roman Catholic school because I was given choices. So given choices meant I had a mediocre academic background, but what I was never given was the intervention of those three areas. So I based my life upon helping people to come to grips with their own creativity and to come to grips with their own destiny. Just before I came here, I was briefly introduced myself to a young student at the coffee shop. She's homeschooling her. I mean, she's being homeschooled. So she had a book. She had these religious books. One was called Mere Christianity, or by C.S. Lewis. And I said, "Did you know C.S. Lewis has in the second chapter about a tree is a tree?" And I said, in the Ojibwe world, a tree could have 14 different definitions. And I was humorously talking to her. She said she was accepted, she thought of Harvard, she thought of other things, and she thought of a school in New York, and she may be going to she wanted to major in humanities, and she said the job market isn't good for humanities. So then I said to her, very briefly, I probably spent, because you have to be careful with space and sharing things, I says, be true to yourself, that's the harmony construct, and decide what you want to do. Don't worry about job. find a school that you may want. Of course, then I suggested typical cultural admissions person. I said, my daughter's a professor at Evergreen State College where they teach portfolio competency-based learning. And I said, because you're homeschooled. And then I said, Dartmouth teaches in a different model. She said, I checked Harvard, but you might go to maybe a different school. But what was interesting, this young woman at age 18 has already on her road to her interest, but she was moving a little too quickly, worrying about, will there be a job market in the humanities? What she's doing, though, is formation, and the fact that I was non-judgmental and suggesting those three areas. And she kind of accepted, I said briefly, because she works part-time at the coffee shop, and when somebody's so good at being a student, you try not to invade their privacy or their space. So she thanked me. But why is that important? It's back to my context. I trusted the wrong people in the academy or the university. So when I started to trust myself and trust my own harmony, my own worldview, that doesn't mean I don't manage conflict, manage issues. I found that I was teaching at a university. Well, before that, I was the only Native student at the college I attended at Northern College, Northern Wisconsin. And that's very interesting, being the only Native student. Today, that would not happen because you could YouTube a friend, you could read something, you could talk to somebody, this instant communication, but you have to be a friend to yourself besides a friend to the larger construct. And what I've learned from that is the ability to manage the risk. And then when I went to a graduate school for counseling, and I didn't finish my master's thesis, but what I enjoyed was experiential learning. So my first job teaching at a university up north, I had a 2-credit Native Issues class. It was a time when I was sitting with the history department chairman. We were having coffee, and he said, Mr. Ackley, Richard, would you be interested in doing a 2-credit class? I said, sure. So I designed it, and they didn't pay me more money. And I had a lot of fun because I had this model of learning. It was an Indian Studies discussion course, and some of the students, I based it upon no grades but contract model. And some of those students from that 49 years ago, some have gone on to do many things. But what I've learned from that, if you give somebody the ability to understand a topic, enter into a social contract or enter into an educational contract, what you call today competency-based, they will succeed. If you don't succeed, then the letter grade, I was speaking to a friend before I got involved in this. She's a artist and she teaches black ash basket making. She said, well, one student isn't showing up to do the basket, and this young woman is from Alaska, and maybe she sees the Native experience as a gift. But I said, yeah, but she still has to weave the basket. You still have to take the math class. You still have to take the chemistry class. You still have to learn something. So therefore, the intervention, even at that level, if you don't interact with people, don't take a bigger risk. Now, I don't know if this person is going to pass the class, but to get back to the context of, there are cultural people who are negative towards your own journey, and to be in harmony is to manage that negativity that might enter into your life. Otherwise, it throws you out of balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It'd be interesting just to get on the interview if you would describe, this kind of reminds me of something else you'd talked about once, describe resisting being named and claimed. I thought that was a good metaphor.
Okay, and I've been deeply influenced by a New Zealand or Maori scholar, and her book on decolonization methodologies. talks about don't let anyone name, claim, or tame you. By name, if you have a cultural identity and a tribal identity, and it's not fabricated by your parents or by something out of the comic books, then you have a right to your tribal identity. Even though today, of the 576 tribes, Native people across the country, it's important to know two things about your naming. What lineal construct you come out of. If there's a legal context to that, that's important. But the legal and cultural context can be in balance. If you don't have the legal identity, you have the cultural identity. What you don't want to do is do an artificial identity where you don't have the foundational principles of that naming. So someone says to me, well, Richard, at age 77, do you know your Ojibwe language? I said, yes, I do. My parents chose not to have me speak, my grandparents, reared me not to speak Ojibwe. I suppose I've got to learn a few words, but I do have an Ojibwe mindset of understanding the culture I'm part of. It gets back to the cognitive thinking. So that would be the naming. When someone else names you, they take power away from your own self-worth or your own construct. 2, tame is a manipulative, exploitive model where people want you to learn a certain way, but they're not giving you the opportunities to learn other ways. In my 18 years as a tribal judge, I tried to remind people in my role of neutrality is to give people the opportunity to balance out their options. If you don't balance out your options, then someone is claiming your own decision making. And the restorative justice model that I used, I wanted people to take some responsibility for the consequence of their own actions. If somebody names you, he or she or whoever it is, then tends to dominate or exploit your worth. And claim gets back to my name, claim, name or tame or claim, and that it's not any, the order could be inverted. If someone claims you, then they treat you as a dehumanized individual within the construct of your own self-worth and in the construct of the tribe or the kinship you're part of. Well, someone says, you come out of the 60s, are you an activist? I define activism to me is the worth of a human being. I highly value education. I highly value the opportunity for people to take responsibility for their own actions. Now, the consequences of that, though, is you have to define what that means. Because if you name yourself, then you have to live what that naming is all about. If you claim your own energies and your own worth, then you have to nurture that in the harmony of your culture and your environment. If you let someone else tame you or control you, then you're never fully going through life in a harmony way. Because if you're 5 years old and you're dominated, I often said you're going to be 85-year-old and dominated. So you got, and in our culture, whether it be settler colonialism, whether it be indigenous tribalism, whether it be any of the religions of the world, if you don't have that harmony or balance between the two, then you have to find a way to decolonize yourself, whereas the colony. Now, in contrast to this, there are some individuals who handle that cultural human roadmap very well. Perhaps it was good for me to explain that when I meet people, some people are just healthy and they understand that. So in the year 2023, we have the opportunity for many tribal people to find their own journey and to make use of the technologies, make use of the learning tools that take place. I think I shared with you that my cousin's son did a movie, and he just kind of a shy guy, worked at it, just did what he had to do, went to the Robert Redford Sundance, did everything, got the movie produced, and he sold the rights, and he's doing these things. Another person is doing something else. So no longer do we have one Native student in college or universities or any educational setting. But if that one person doesn't reach out and doesn't participate in society, then that one person is not fully maximizing their human potential, because the roadblocks or the settings in the world could be church polity, could be educational polity by whoever runs the system. So in summary, don't let anyone name you that dominate you. Don't let anyone tame you, because by taming, they modify your behavior, psychological conditioning. And don't let anyone claim you. You've got to claim your own destiny, but this can be done very privately as you encounter your own worldview and your own sense of place. But how you, we call it, when I was in graduate school, we had these growth groups, and we would take 6 sessions. Young people would transfer in college, and we graduate students were given the opportunity to work with people. And in some ways, these settings, but the person always has to be vigilant of their worth, because in the old biblical tradition, as the light roareth in the night, you've got to be vigilant to your own Christian, spiritual, indigenous journey.
Mm-hmm. It would be, I think it might be helpful for people to hear, in light of what you just said, to hear an example about how Ojibwe people might raise a child. Like, maybe an example of how they would treat a child in a particular situation or something that would sort of illustrate what you're talking about.
Yeah, and to me, making the decision to rear a child is not the same as the consequences of what that child has to unfold in a marginal environment. You can have the most healthiest parents or grandparents, but you still have to face the elements of they. Like in my own case, I was reared by my grandparents, and my parents were legally married, as I find out. But for some reason, they were so young. My father returned from the service, and my mother was 17 or 18. And for some reason, the relationship was not working out. So my mother's parents decided to raise me. Now, it would have helped if they would have shared with me how that social contract took place. I know I have tribal friends who adopt children and they have a relationship, but for mine, I was given the opportunity, maybe that's where the freedom came in, to search out my own understanding of that. Now, later in life, I did meet my biological mother, she passed on, I'm very close to those children. I met my biologically father, I'm very close to them, and one has passed on. I was raised in my mother's family with uncles and aunts, and they have, some of them has passed on. But then my grandparents would invite other people into the family. So the family kinship was one of acceptance. It was a time when there was no welfare model, there was no guardian ad litem, there was no family support assessment. And in 1945, I was blessed. And perhaps the reason why that I got so much involved in detail in the legalistic world is by acceptance. It was a cultural acceptance, but not a legal acceptance. So I had to make sure all the documents were in place. My grandmother legally adopted me. I did everything that I had to do. But today, none of that would exist. So one of my friends said, I was the end of a generation. I'm a traditionalist born in 1945, but I still had the relationship where grandparents could make that decision. today with health care and with so many other difficulties, in some tribes, grandparents they can make those decisions. And then the system I came out of, not everyone benefited from it. My parents had a store, a restaurant, a gas station, a boat landing, a trucking operation. So we had a system that I was able to participate in. So when I went to the school system or the cultural system, the two systems, there were more complexities in my family social tribal system than complexities in the larger system. So what I figured out after all these years, there was not the kind of help in the larger system. Today, you're hoping to help is present. You have an understanding how you help people. But for me, I have understood that. So the key to me has been education, but I never realized, as much as I disliked the academy or the university, I was sitting down because we were given independent thought processes. My grandfather and his two brothers would meet on weekends. They'd talk about Native history. They'd spend like 3 days discussing issues. As a little 10, 12-year-old boy, I would listen to all these storylines. I'd bring him coffee, or my parents had a beer tavern. I'd listen to the people in the bar talking, but I always had this ability to say, how long can I stay with certain groups? That doesn't mean, the dynamics of the system were not difficult. But what was interesting was I lived in a time that there was the transition from small tribal community to larger. That was falling apart. So then what happened in the 60s, the transfer to the border town and other opportunities took place. I was able to stay out of the service. I was able to stay out of I was not relocated. I was able to stay out of the factory job in the local border town because the factory closed. So a lot of things, just by circumstances, I didn't have to participate in. So in some ways, having that freedom, there was a consequence of freedom, though, because I wasn't too much of today, what you would call an organizational mature person. But in those days, I had to nurture myself. So I spent my entire life sharing with people that they have an opportunity. Some listen, some are indifferent, some don't. So having that context of harmony, I made the best situation out of could have been a very unpleasant situation. And given the opportunity to do that, in my court work, I've always tried to provide some sense of restorative justice or restorative options for people. What I do not like to see is where grandparents become the substitute babysitters for dependent parents, either by virtue of drugs or virtue of inadequacies. You've got to help people find ways to stand and to be responsible for their own actions. So if anything, that helped me. But to get back to the family I'm part of, I didn't realize how many people took programs that dealt with resiliency, change, and finding your own level of competencies. I always think of my cousin who wrote a book on elder etymology, and I never can get these correct, about every Ojibwe person has to be respectful, they have to be responsible, and reciprocity, and they have to have a renewal. So I suppose I've ever coined my life, I would say my role in life is to help someone find the options to be resilient. How that's defined depends upon each human being in the cultural context. And harmony is one of seasonality, and harmony is one of understanding that journey. Where I had difficulty is trying to articulate that journey I'm still having difficulty articulating that journey to university types, to legalistic types, to cultural types, to money types, to people who realize that Native people in the Ojibwe world have a sense of their own being, and you define activism individually, but you never give up your culturalism or your tribe, but nobody should dominate you, what you believe in. Because if that happens, then you're not entering the relationship in a mature way. To parallel it to Christianity, I enter into a social contract or a covenant with my Creator, and that covenant is to be accepting of me in my, either with grace or even when I have a sense of where I have to improve myself, not one of denomination. I think maybe we've had this discussion before. I think the Calvinistic or the settler Reformation model of, give away your native experience is something that I find very uncomfortable. And when that starts to happen, I try to negotiate myself with tolerance, with respect, and hold back, because questions like, how did you become who you are? How much Indian are you? What does Christianity? You see it through whatever you see it through. And so my favorite line is, whether it be the Gospel of John, peace be with you, or peace be with you. The Acts of the Apostles just living in community. I mean, the Acts is when you take care of your family, you're acting out. When you're on the road to Emmaus, or whatever you want to call it, could it just be you encounter people, you want to be healthy? Coming from a small tribe, large tribe, but where you had to be responsible for your family unit. And I never could understand the words like pagan, like savage, all these negative terms that did not uplift your culture. I tell a very cute story, and I guess maybe as I get older, the story is one of my Roman Catholic priest friends, who has since retired, Father Mike. He passed on about 15 years ago. I said, Father Mike, how did you get along in the Amazon? I said, when you were way out there in the bush and you had to do communion, what did you do? He said, I got into their cultural element, understanding their belief systems. And what happened, and the reason why that's so important, one of my good friends, his name is Herman, he's into the cosmologies and archoastronomy. And he said, you Ojibwe people in the universe, you see the natural order. And the Judeo-Christian and all the other religions of the world, maybe some have the natural order. But if you're into the natural order, then you're seeing the world in a natural way. So why not accept the Creator? Why not accept Jesus Christ? Because the articulation of that time period in his life, it was a natural order. There was behaviors, and that would be my interpretation. Now, a bunch of theologians would tell me differently, but I was chuckling with C.S. Lewis, and that wasn't the purpose of his 3 stories, saying a tree is just a tree. Well, a tree in the Ojibwe world has 14 different definitions. Like right now, the maple for syrup, the black ash for baskets, the birch for baskets, the little humor of my father told me to go out and cut a load of wood with a group of people, and I was excited. I've had 2 people with me. I was 16. I had the car with the trailer. I went out and I cut this load of wood, and I had the guys organize. I'm in the Gap leadership, so I thought I'd be a good leader to organize this. And the guys listened to me. I got back my wood. And I said, look at that maple. He said, look at that again. That's box elder. That won't burn. I said, well, what do I do now? He said, this is what maple looks like. Take that image, go out and get maple. He said, but what I do is it'll dry out. What was interesting, nowadays you could take an iPhone and you could take a picture of a tree. It'll produce what the species of the tree is. But for me, that box elder lesson was one of the best in my life, because he wasn't judgmental. He didn't shame me. Actually, it was, I look back at it, but the 2 guys, the 2 gentlemen, the 2 young men I was with, I think they knew, but they let me experience my own stupidity, but then I figured it out. But yet doing things that are not, it's like research. How many experiments do you have? Last little humor, and I think it fits the harmony. If you're in settings where something spills, I used to have this, I made this baby buggy and I took off, it was like a 30-gallon, the big milk can or whatever. I would go get water at the pump. So I was all excited. It was a little like the cold weather. I brought back I turned too quick with my little baby buggy and all the water spilled. I said to my father, my grandfather, what do I do now? He said, I believe you go back and get some more water because the water spilled. But he didn't criticize me. But people who have grown up on the farm or people who have grown up in the city have those experiences. But it's all right to criticize when you not criticize. It's all right to analyze in a positive way and to enrich yourself in a way to help you become in a harmony or congruent way. But it was so nice to have those experiences because I had to become resilient. But the theme is if you got to trust yourself, you got to make assessments of who your teachers are, your spiritual advisors, or in relationship to your community. If you don't, then you get easily manipulated. And my goal in life is to try to help people make those decisions on their own. And generally speaking, they arrive at a responsible decision, generally speaking.
I'd like to go back to something you mentioned earlier, and you've talked about this some, but it'd be nice to kind of hear it in one spot here. For people that are unfamiliar, well, they're two different things really, but for people who are unfamiliar with the four directions, how would you explain it? How would you help someone understand the importance of it and for harmony?
Well, there are three aspects, maybe four. One is the contemporary aspect of somebody, as we speak, student or a person can Google four directions. That's one. It could be anything. Two, the four directions has to be experienced in the context of experience. For me, growing up, that would be the experience of four directions. And then the third one is how the four directions are interpreted within the cultural context. I'll go back to the middle one, how it's experienced. But I had to do that construct of the three. There'd be many more. But as I get up in the morning, and in the Ojibwe world, it's facing east in many cultures because of the sunrise. As a older person or under age 30, I used to do some sweat lodges with a friend of mine. The gentleman has since passed on, a tribal elder, who had a sweat lodge, and only men would do the sweat and women do the sweat. So we would, and I've never gone the full 4 rounds, so we would do the sweats, and then we'd go into Lake Spirit, and then we would see the sunrise in the east. That would be one aspect. And then I'm going to do the four directions. The north in the Ojibwe world would be the north, the cosmologies, the sky. But then in the Ojibwe world, some people tell me the energy centers are the medicine wheel, if you want to call it. There's energy centers in the north. Why is that important? My spiritual elder friend, my spiritual director said, there's the Western doorway, or the doorways of life, the universe. Remember, I got back to the culture. So my friend would say the Western doorway would be as the door as the sun sets. The south, coming up from the south, the culture that I'm growing, it could be the wind, it could be the south. But the reason why I share that, where I grew up in a sense of place, Lake Superior in the north, and the south, Louisiana and Mississippi, it's a large continuum of different temperate zones. I mean, it could be cold up north, it could be 75 degrees in the Gulf of Mexico, the orientation of the Mississippi and these things. I'm not doing this justice in the sense of academic of the four directions, but then some people say the four directions reflect the four views of humanity, the black, the red, whatever groups they are. But in the four directions, no matter what culture you are, you place value on your system. And I say it where the culture and environment coexist. But there are as many definitions to the four directions, but the four directions have to fit your sense of place. For people in Dene or Navajo land have a different image. The people in Alaska have a different image. And the people closer to the north have a different image. My son-in-law, who is a member of a tribe in Louisiana, they have a large French, Cajun, or dynamic, and they have a comfort. But then underlining all this is there seems to be, and one of my friends who does a lot of research on the larger cities of the larger amounts of population in the Americas, whether it be the mounds or the folks. So it's the time in history where the four directions took place. But then what happened, either through the settler or the environments of this relationship of people, if you lived in harmony, but then if you came exposed to viruses, like we recently got out of the COVID, you became exposed to people that are trying to, maybe the settlers were the new Romans, I don't know, they became subject to colonists. And then the third one is, if that came about, how do people live together? And the way they live together is if you really adhere to the principles of Jesus Christ, you really adhere to the principles of your culture, then the four directions are helpful to at least allow you to live that way. But what happens in a culture I've had this discussion with other people, there's always this question about how do you validate this? How do you explain this? Well, by faith, because I don't see anyone coming back yet. There's this, what do they say? There's the burning bush imagery of the manifestation of the Spirit, the burning bush, whatever that is. But if you don't manifest some burning sensation in you, turning your life over to your belief system, turning your life over to understand your place in the universe, then the four directions, I see the four directions in a manner of seasonality and living your life out in a manner that allows for that to take place. But the reason I'm careful about that, it gets back to the understanding, because the minute I express myself, somebody will Google or Wikipedia or the old days, the encyclopedias, this is the definition of four directions worldwide, comparative religion cultures. 2, this is a definition of four directions as I was growing up in the sense of place you are. And the third one is, how does the four directions in a mosaic way, some people won't even accept mosaic, how does these interpretations help you in your journey of life? If you don't have that equation, you don't have that method, and I suppose in our world we'd call it, there has to be a process you arrive at something. And I don't have to defend this because I live this. But if somebody wants me to defend it, it's not an argumentative discussion. I think too many of the theology, too many of the religious professor types. This is why I've enjoyed work like, there's authors like Steve Charlson, Bishop Steve Charlson, authors like Richard Twist. And there's a series of people, Mind the Laureate God has read. There's a series of people who help you formulate your belief systems in a manner that you can interchange or understand it as you go through your journey of life. And if you don't explore that, then you're not what I call in harmony. You're not in balance. Then you become a little bit too regimentated. It gets back to my name, claim, and tame. Because you have to find ways in your narrative to support that. Mine has been one of being positive because I have great difficulty being negative. I mean, that's not to say I'm not, most of my life I've spent around people who complain, but is it based upon oppression? Is it based upon trauma? Is it based upon just to be alive, just to be aware of who you are? And that is important, but what you're trying not to do is get trapped by people who dominate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, that's good. That's good stuff. Now, you've mentioned a couple scriptures, but are there a couple of the scriptures in the Bible that that have been very meaningful for you in terms of harmony?
One of the difficulties with the religious model and the circumstance of the church calendar year of the faith tradition I'm out of, I would say, and this is so standard, I would say it's the baptismal covenant because somebody had to sponsor me in a baptismal way. Remember I stated I didn't have to do this religious journey because every morning I'd walk by the Methodist Church to go to the Roman Catholic Church. Nobody gave me the opportunity, or no one forced me to go to the Roman Catholic school. No one forced me to. Actually, I like the Methodist model much better because when I walked by, they're always singing. They're always singing. The little Methodist church had more of a native presence than the Roman Catholic sisters. But what the Roman Catholic sisters provided me with is a sense of place with people my age, and we had food. But the reason why that I'm saying that is the baptismal covenant was something that there was a sponsorship. The other one I would say as I got older is if you're going to have a routine or religious experience, someone ought to protect and nurture you in that rather than have it based upon performance. I was not a good little Roman Catholic Mass server because it just wasn't something that I cared to do, but I was a good student. And the Roman Catholic sisters thought I was a good student. And the grade system they used, it was I's and E's and U's. And a E was above an A, and an I was an A like an A, and a U was like a B. So the base system of learning I had was based upon a different model. So maybe that's been my problem. I never had an ABC grade system. Why is that important? It's important that the sisters gave me the opportunity of learning, even though it's a cultural. Never did they deny my cultural identity, and that's a little different. In the residential school, there was a kids were living in what we call the St. Mary's Orphanage, but I believe the culture I'm from, the tribal community, they were not originally, they left the island and there was the United Church of Christ, our Congregational Church, and then the Congregational Church left and the Roman Catholics picked up the franchise in 1899. So I think there was always this conflict between Protestant and Roman Catholic, and some of us lean more towards the Protestant. The little community I'm from had 3,000 people. Then when the timber went down, the community started to almost fall apart, but the tribalism kept the community intact. So we have 7,000 members today of the Red River Band Lake Superior Chippewa, but in the year from 1910 to 1914 to 1918, we had a newspaper called the Odana Star. Native people were very much part of it. There was a traditional system, but there wasn't this conflict. So I would say, to get back to a specific, the social covenant means I embrace the gospel, I embrace it. That's a little more abstract than a specific passage. But if I don't embrace the journey, then I don't embrace, I'm probably more of a New Testament person but the Old Testament, one of my friends said, you Ojibwe people are, if you think of the Torah and the Psalms, with the tribe that I'm from, we have a protocol and a procedure. One of my friends said, we probably have more rules and regulations in the Ojibwe world than the Torah. Now, some scholar will challenge me on that, but find that out. We have a ritual for the seasons. We have a ritual for this. We have something for that. Praising the journey when somebody passes on, when someone's born. So there's a whole composite. So as you ask me that, I've not had the need to give up my cultural identity and turn my life over to the Creator, over my life to Jesus Christ. It's been more of a merging. But then the Gospel of John is something that I enjoy. Peace be with you, those kinds of things. But what I try not to do, in fact, we've had a discussion about this, and you shared with me about 3 years ago, the book of the New Testament in the 4 definitions, the Greek or whatever that book was. Maybe you can. It was the dynamic.
The harmony.
Yeah, and what I'm humorously saying though is allow somebody the ability to formulate their own Christology, their own belief system, but yet that doesn't mean you're negating any of the formation of Old Testament, New Testament, and all these interpretations. But it took me a while to determine that the settler people that came across were not giving me the complete story. We were interpreting it in the method of their, I'm not picking on German theologians or English theologians, what do you want to call them, but for some reason, nobody wants to put the equality of the spiritual indigenous people, theologians. I think Vine Deloria said it best, God is red. He wasn't using that in the sense, we know they came out of the Middle East, we know, all those things, but he's saying how you apply that in a model. So I would say, and then the Psalms, it took me a while to understand this, some are praise and some are lamenting. Well, in the culture, in many traditional cultures, you praise and you lament. I mean, those dynamics. So you can almost parallel, there's a deal in the Episcopal Church called gospel-based discipleship, where you can interject your belief system. I think the African system has a similar model, where you interpret the gospel, or you interpret the system to apply to your model. But if somebody hard pressed me, I would say the awareness, understanding those kinds of areas that over the years I've been left to my own. Maybe I've been thankful that I had spiritual directors later in life, because they never challenged my innovation. But yet what you're trying to do, though, is not become so hung up. Another one, though, that I like, maybe it's the tradition I come out of, I like the word Advent, because it's a new beginning. The Advent, you cleanse yourself. I like the Christmas or the birth of Christ, because it's the vulnerability, and the child is protected by the family, not everyone's protected. I come out of the court system. I have a little difficulty with Lent because the cross theology people, I know the redemption, but integration of that model. Many of my Lutheran friends, if I haven't heard so much about cross theology, it tires me sometimes. Because if you try to invoke guilt and you come from a culture where you're into redemption and forgiveness, and I try not to get off on that because that whole period of what I like about the Lent is the preparation and discipline. So that would be a context of preparation and discipline. What I like about the redemption, or when the Christ is by faith travels to be with the Father or the Mother, it means by faith you will be with me in the universe. And then the other one, which I really enjoy, and everyone just laughs at me, is Pentecost. Week after week after week after week. But then I know the flowers are planting, the food is planting, and I just can't wait till August when wild rice falls and the kernels start falling in the boat. I know it's a little after Ascension, a little after that period, but Pentecost is so exciting for me because that's the end of 25, 30 weeks. Tell I'm the church calendar guy here. But the wild rice, because it's so important for me as nurturance. Then when fall comes and the elements of fall and cedar and all that good stuff. So for me, I live and breathe by faith. So that's why the church calendar doesn't present a problem. I'm maybe not as excited about the Christian daily prayer, the mid-prayer, the even prayer, the 5 dynamics. But what I find interesting over the years, a time of my life I spent a little time with, I don't want to call it Russian Orthodox, but St. Herman's Hermitage. I'd like to make my trip to Alaska, where I really enjoy the evening prayer where you're in retreat and you're in a chapel with one of my friends he was a Protestant Presbyterian who wanted to become an Orthodox guy, went to Europe. He's now 86 years old, and he's accepted that he's Protestant and he's Orthodox now. What I can't do is I'm embedded. If you think of microchips in the computer world, I'm embedded in my Ojibwe spirituality, and I can't deprogram that. I can't wipe it clean. I can't get rid of it. The Christianity thing is something I constantly explore. And then the Christian spirituality, the traditional spirituality, those things are embedded in me, but no way am I going to give up the journey I have as an indigenous Christian. My indigenous personality and my tribalism has been one of strength and liberation. My Christian experience has been a little bit not healthy in some ways because lack of trust, lack of nurturance, lack of clarity. The first thing this seminary person said, well, we need to build trust. I says, the fact that I'm here, the fact that I'm alive should be a testimony that I've survived and people have trusted me and allowed me to grow as a baby. How do we help people grow without domination, without manipulation? And most settlers, I believe I've had this conversation before, till you can develop tools for resiliency and for renewal and redemption. So in some ways, I've laid out the full construct of a belief system. It's a living system with me. And even in my finite world, I still have to live I still live and appreciate these interests in my life. Because one thing, I have two skills in life that has not helped me well. One is I'm consistent, and the other one is I won't give up. Now, if I'm consistent, I won't be consistent in accommodation. By not giving up, I won't compromise in a system that's shallow. So those two areas have created to me, they could be joy, they could be negative, but I have to live this. So I've learned how to do this in a manner that's almost like it's the caring and the nurturance is something that I will not give up. I mean, it's something that I believe in. So if that comes from those integrations of the tribal spirituality, it comes from the integration of my generational kinship family background, and comes from the understanding of my indigenous Judeo-Christian formation. But not everyone has to go through that. Everyone may have that. Like the young person who I talked to this morning very briefly, I didn't have to say anything. She's making decisions on her own. But the fact that she accepted in Mere Christianity that, and maybe C.S. Lewis in the radio, a tree is not just a tree in my world. I mean, today, you will not hear the word pagan. You'll not hear the word savage. You won't hear the word Washington or Washington Commanders. In 2005, I kind of chuckled. I said to my friend who gave a presentation at the State of a Tribe address in Wisconsin, I said, this mascot issue is maybe not because I'm just wanting legalistic issues and court decisions. And fast forward in 2023, the mascot issue has been somewhat managed. The federal government has changed the names of certain lakes. And I mean, we have a long ways to go, but I prefer to be affirmative and not to spin out into a negative model. But it's a constant vigilant. We have to be vigilant all the time, because we're not vigilant and we're not having, and this is what I find the church calendar, I find exciting. But yet that repetition is something that can become routine, and you have to live out your, as they say in our world, in your world, you have to live out the gospel, you have to live out your message, but you have to manage it in a manner that you don't get spun out of control. You got to worry about your own allocation of time.